Red warning lights washed across operations rooms as tanker crews waited in the dark waters near the Strait of Hormuz. Radar screens flickered. Phones rang in trading houses from Dubai to London. Warships shifted position under a moonless sky. Every movement looked dangerous. Every delay carried a price. Then the signal came from Washington. After weeks of demanding that Iran reopen the Strait of Hormuz, President Donald Trump was reportedly prepared to end the war without making that a final condition. That changed everything at once. The Strait of Hormuz is not a side issue. It is one of the most important energy choke points on Earth. If the White House is now willing to settle without fully reopening it, then the war may be entering a new and more uncertain phase. This was not simply a diplomatic adjustment. It was a sign that the limits of escalation may now be colliding with the costs of continuing the fight. According to Reuters, citing Wall Street Journal reporting and comments from senior U.S. officials, Trump has told aides he is willing to make a deal to end the war, even if the Strait of Hormuz remains at least partly blocked. U.S. Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth said talks were active and gaining strength. He also warned that the next few days would be decisive if Iran refused to comply. U.S. officials said American pressure has already changed the balance. General Dan Kane stated that the United States continues to degrade Iranian capabilities. Reuters also reported that U.S. officials said more than 150 Iranian naval vessels had been taken out. In this version of events, Washington believes it now holds the advantage. Trump's criticism of countries that have refused to help secure the Strait of Hormuz sharpened that message. The White House appears to be saying the United States will not carry the full burden of restoring global shipping while allies hold back. The symbolic shift is striking. The Strait of Hormuz was framed as a central objective. It is now being treated more like leverage inside a possible settlement. That suggests the administration may want an exit before the war grows even more expensive. But the story quickly became far more complicated. Before we break down what this sudden Hormuz shift means for war, oil, and diplomacy, make sure you hit the like button and subscribe to the channel so you never miss the latest dramatic developments shaping global geopolitics. According to Iranian officials and Iranian state media, Tehran is telling a very different story. Iranian military spokesmen have warned that if the United States strikes Iran's power grid or energy network, then Gulf energy systems, information infrastructure, and water desalination plants could become targets in return. Iranian officials have also insisted that the Strait of Hormuz is not fully closed in a universal sense. They say passage remains possible for shipping that coordinates with Tehran and is not linked to what Iran calls its enemies. That distinction gives Iran room to apply pressure while avoiding the language of an absolute blockade. How is that pressure applied? Through layered disruption. A mine does not need to sink a ship to stop traffic. A coastal missile battery does not need to fire to force tankers to turn back. A drone attack on one vessel can freeze dozens more. Naval escorts help, but they do not solve everything. Ships must move slowly. Routes must be cleared. Air defenses must watch for low-flying threats in a narrow corridor with very little reaction time. In simple terms, the Strait of Hormuz can remain technically open while becoming practically unsafe for normal trade. Reuters reported that some ships managed negotiated passage, but most remained stuck, waiting for better security conditions. Between these rival accounts lies the real danger. Analysts are still trying to determine how much of the strait is open, how much is contested, and how long that gray zone can hold. Why does the Strait of Hormuz matter so much? Because this narrow waterway carries weight far beyond its size. The Strait of Hormuz sits between Iran and Oman. It links the Persian Gulf to the Arabian Sea. It is one of the world's most critical oil choke points. According to the U.S. Energy Information Administration, about 20 million barrels of oil per day moved through the Strait of Hormuz in 2024. That equals roughly 20% of global petroleum liquids consumption and more than 1/4 of global seaborne oil trade. Around 1/5 of global LNG trade also passed through the same corridor, much of it from Qatar. That makes the Strait of Hormuz more than a route on a map. It is an export valve for Gulf producers. It is a supply lifeline for Asian importers. It is a price trigger for the global economy. Saudi Arabia alone accounted for 5.5 million barrels per day of crude and condensate flows through Hormuz in 2024, according to the EIA. China, India, Japan, and South Korea were the biggest destination markets. There are bypass options, but they are limited. The EIA estimates Saudi and UAE pipelines could provide only about 2.6 million barrels per day of spare bypass capacity in a major disruption. That is not enough to replace normal flows. So when Iran threatens the Strait of Hormuz, it is not just warning Washington, it is sending a signal to Europe, to Asia, and to every market that depends on stable energy movement. The message was clear. Iran can still push the cost of conflict far beyond the battlefield. What comes next if the Strait of Hormuz becomes a bargaining chip rather than a fixed war aim? First comes the military response. Reuters reported that U.S. strikes are continuing against Iranian manufacturing and research sites. Israeli operations are continuing as well. Reinforcements have also been moving in. Reuters said thousands of troops from the U.S. Army's 82nd Airborne Division have started arriving in the region. That does not mean a ground war is certain, but it does mean options are expanding. And in a crisis like this, more options can also mean more pathways to escalation. Then comes the regional reaction. U.S. allies have shown deep reluctance. Reuters reported that Germany, Spain, and Italy ruled out immediate participation in any mission to reopen the Strait of Hormuz by force. Britain and Denmark signaled limited openness, but only with a strong emphasis on de-escalation. China and Pakistan called for an immediate ceasefire. That matters because Washington cannot easily build a broad coalition if key partners believe the mission is too risky or too politically costly. Gulf governments face a different fear. Iranian threats have included energy sites and desalination plants. In parts of the Gulf, desalination provides most of the drinking water, so a strike on infrastructure is not just an energy issue, it becomes a civilian stability issue very quickly. That spike in security risk has direct economic consequences. Reuters reported that Brent crude rose to about $119 per barrel and was heading for a record monthly gain of 64%. In the United States, the national average gasoline price crossed $4 a gallon for the first time in more than 3 years. Oil prices rose, fuel costs climbed, shipping expenses surged, and that shock does not stay in the Gulf. It spreads through freight, manufacturing, electricity, and household budgets. The European Union is already considering emergency-style responses previously used during the Russian gas crisis. A tanker attack off Dubai only reinforced how fragile the system has become. After that comes diplomatic pressure. The EU has discussed whether its Aspides naval mission, now focused on the Red Sea, could be adapted in some form to the Strait of Hormuz. The United Nations has entered discussions about possible mechanisms to stabilize maritime traffic. But diplomacy is moving through mistrust. Several European governments have made clear they were not properly consulted before the conflict widened. Now they are being asked to help manage the fallout. That is a hard sell. And finally, there is the domestic political effect inside the United States. Higher gasoline prices hit fast. They hit voters directly. They hit consumer confidence. They hit the White House. What began as a military confrontation is now becoming a test of economic endurance and political timing. The Trump administration maintains that U.S. military pressure has weakened Iran enough to justify a deal, even if the Strait of Hormuz is not fully reopened immediately. Iran maintains that the Strait of Hormuz remains legitimate leverage and that any settlement must reflect the damage and pressure Tehran has absorbed. Those claims now sit side by side. Neither cancels the other. Neither resolves the crisis. If Washington ends the war without fully restoring free passage, it risks showing that disruption works. If Iran presses the Strait of Hormuz too hard, it risks pushing outside powers toward a tougher and broader response. That is the unstable balance now taking shape. One side wants a controlled exit, the other wants strategic leverage, and the Strait of Hormuz remains at the center of both calculations. This is why the latest shift matters so much. The question is no longer only whether the fighting can stop. The question is what kind of peace emerges if one of the world's most important choke points remains partially contested even after a deal. Will this crisis end as a temporary rupture, or as the start of a new era of permanent pressure in the Strait of Hormuz? Stay tuned for further updates as this situation continues to develop. And don't forget to like and subscribe so you never miss the latest dramatic geopolitical developments shaping the world.